Greetings, Kerbonauts! This is Kerbal Space Program. I'm Bob Fitch, and this is episode number 5 of Project Ares, the real solar system look at an alternate Earth history in which we have our brave Kerbal explorers who have gone through to Earth and are now setting their sights on Earth's moon. It's time for a new type of launcher, and on the pad we have the Sphinx. The last launcher, you remember we called it the Phoenix. This one is the Sphinx. It's powered by one core stage, 2 solid motors on the sides, an upper stage, and then the payload itself also has some fuel and an engine, but we're still working that part out. Nonetheless, we are ready for our first launch. We're somewhat optimistic, but this is the first time that our explorers are trying to do anything out quite that far or with the amount of power that it's going to take to get us to the moon. So we'd be happy with even a partial success. We've got some new technology on this flight, like we will on almost all flights. In this case, we're adding deployable solar panels, a new type of engine for the core stage, solid rocket motors, kerosene as a fuel instead of alcohol, and some new science instruments on the payload. In the last episode, we had to close the wormhole to Kerbin and communication was cut off. So we've had to step up our technology production, and now hundreds of additional human scientists have been added to the research teams. And with the full weight of the world behind the EUSA, things are starting to move far more rapidly than they did in real life in this time period. In fact, in the coming episodes, you're going to see things will move really fast now. We're going to diverge quite a bit. But let's take a look first at the rocket and its payload. We'll start off here at the bottom. Remember, I just said we have new engines on here. These are the Sphinx engines. I'll take this heat shield off so that you can see it just a little bit better right there. There's 2 of them. They have a little bit of gimbal, which gives me control over all the axes, pitch, yaw, even roll, because there's 2 of them down there. They're powered by kerosene and liquid oxygen. They have a pretty good thrust, but we're still dealing with low technology in terms of ISP 290 to 314, so we're going to be improving that over the next years in order to get further and further away from Earth. The boosters on the side, we can see here we have the Sphinx solid motors. Each of those has more thrust than the 2 engines combined, so the majority of our thrust is coming from those solid motors on the sides. You can see that they have a little bit of gimbal as well, and just like the gimbal on the early solid motors like this, there's a tank on the outside that contains high test peroxide, and that feeds down into the motor that actually controls the gimbal. The center is where the solid fuel is. So if you've ever wondered what those tanks were on the outside, those contain the gimbaling propellant. Also on those, we have some separation solid motors. I have a couple up there and a couple down on the bottom. As we move our way up through the center here, you can see I'm using that same technique I described before, where the tanks are separated by interstages. In this case, the kerosene is in the tank at the bottom, and we have our liquid oxygen in the tank at the top. All along the outside of it, we also have more lights. Look at that. We got a bunch of lights right there, and lights right there, and lights right there. The thing is beautiful that way. And then up here we have our avionics ring, which is sitting right underneath this interstage, and hiding inside that interstage you can see our upper stage. But we will get to that one in just a moment. First, we need to see the decoupling of our solid motors. Let me just stick this one right back on here for one moment so you can see it again. So these have a thrust curve on them. They start off with a certain amount of P-band fuel and the HTP powering the gimbal engines. They have a thrust curve that looks like this, and as they go over time, the thrust will change. It's automatic, it's built into the Real Fuels mod that I can do that. I just have to put the thrust curve into the config file. Once we get toward the end of the fuel and it's getting down to here, the thrust curve will have dropped the actual thrust of these way down. And I did the math on it. At roughly about 150 to 160 kilonewtons of thrust remaining, That's when these solids are now barely able to push even themselves, and as soon as it drops below 160, they're not really even pushing themselves anymore, and that's the time to decouple them. There will still be a little bit of propellant burning off out of the bottom like a real solid motor would, but it's not enough to actually fight the effects of gravity, and so these will come off and fly off to the sides. So let's take a look at that. Using the awesome new feature of being able to select a part and pin that part information to your screen, you can see I've got it over on the side here, where I can keep an eye on the thrust level of that without having it interfere with the rest of my user interface. When I see the thrust drop, then I can decouple and know that they will safely drop away without having so much remaining thrust that they actually go up along the side too much, which is what happened in a previous test where I had decoupled early and the booster kept going up and went sideways and smashed back into the rocket. Getting back to the current launch, things are going much better, and now we can see the awesome looking high altitude engine plumes for the new Phoenix engines. These are gas generator engines fed with the propellant from the main tanks. We no longer have our turbo pumps being powered by hydrogen peroxide, like in the last launcher. We should look a little at the mechanics of a rocket engine to understand exactly how we're advancing our tech for this launch. A turbo pump supplies propellants to the combustion chamber. Over here we'll have oxidizer, and over here we'll represent the green as fuel. It uses a spinny thing called an impeller to suck that fuel down. One impeller over here brings in the oxidizer, and the other impeller brings in the fuel. One thing to note is there's a danger with this single shaft providing power to both impellers, because you need seals to make sure that some of the oxidizer doesn't leak through along the shaft down to here along with the fuel, and then with the higher temperatures possibly causing the whole thing to explode. Anyway, I got to pick up one of those impellers that are used in the SpaceX Falcon 9 during a visit there. It was awesome, but I can't show a picture of it. They didn't allow pictures inside the factory because they are considered to be a United States defense contractor, so no pictures. Now, in a gas generator engine, it doesn't technically go straight from the impellers into the combustion chamber. Some of the propellant is fed into a smaller combustion chamber here. The fuel and oxidizer mix, that gets burned, and that exhaust comes up here toward the turbine. The turbine then spins the shaft, the two impellers spin, pulling down the fuel and the oxidizer through these valves. Some of it heads down toward the engine, some of it down here, and a little bit of it is being piped into the combustion chamber, which then feeds this and creates that cycle. So once this gets started, it just burns and burns and burns as long as fuel is being supplied in here. If these valves were to get shut off, then this would stop. The valves also control how much goes in if you want to increase the power, though early engines, they just turned on and kept going. It wasn't until later engines that the valves could control how much thrust was being generated by how much combustion was turning the shaft to pull in the fuel even faster. This is how you would start things too. You would have two external tanks of hypergolic fuels, and you would supply both of those up into the smaller gas combustion chamber. They ignite, sending their hot gases up to the turbine, which starts the shaft, which starts the impellers, which brings in the real fuel and the real oxidizer. This gets used up, but then you're going, and so you don't need it anymore. It's self-sustaining at that point. The exhaust from the turbine comes out and it just gets dumped overboard, which is a loss of efficiency, but it makes the engine much simpler. SpaceX engines are like that because it makes them more reliable for using 10 times each instead of just once each. Now technically the fuel doesn't go straight to the combustion chamber. It goes down here to the engine nozzle, some pipes that run around the outside of the nozzle. The fuel goes around through those pipes and then up here comes out and goes into the engine combustion chamber at the top. That helps cool the nozzle while at the same time warming up the fuel before it gets burned up here. Now the fuel is used instead of the oxidizer because, well, think of what it's called. Oxidizer. Oxidizing is another name for rusting, and rusting can happen very fast under the right conditions, like in this rocket engine. So fuel is used to cool this to help prevent the oxidizer from rusting everything during operation. Now this is where the magic happens. Almost everything gets burned here, and exhaust gets compressed right down here in this very small throat. The pressure forces the gases through this throat at the speed of sound. That's actually the maximum speed it can go through this compressed area. And then as the gases escape out into the cone, they exceed the speed of sound. The only limiting factor is the ambient pressure out here and the size of the nozzle at the end. In a vacuum, there's no ambient pressure at all, and so the limiting factor is infinity. And therefore, the real limiting factor becomes the mass of the nozzle, because the bigger you make it, the more it's going to weigh. And then you might reach a point where adding more mass is inefficient, because even though you're getting an improved efficiency here, the overall mass is less efficient. Also, another limiting factor is the size of the stage. This engine needs to fit inside the interstage. Our Phoenix engines were not using the propellants here to feed into the gas generator. Instead, the fuel and the oxidizer just went straight down into the engine, and we had a separate tank of high-test peroxide which fed into the combustion chamber of the gas generator, and then that led back out and got dumped overboard just like the normal. So we had a loss of efficiency from dumping the exhaust, a loss of efficiency from the lower ISP of the HTP, and a loss from the extra tankage that we needed to house the HTP and bring it with us. Now this new Phoenix engine uses kerosene and liquid oxygen and dumps its exhaust into the nozzle itself. So instead of going overboard, it comes down like this and goes into the nozzle and then escapes with the rest of the gases, which increases efficiency just a little bit. In the future, we're going to start using staged combustion. With that kind of engine, we're no longer going to feed a portion of our liquid fuel into the gas generator. So this line goes away right here, and we'll connect this line right up into here. Instead of calling this a gas generator, now we're going to call it a pre-burner, because all of the heated fuel is going in here and getting burnt with a portion of the oxidizer. Now we won't be dumping any of this overboard, because everything that goes past the turbo pump is going to come down to the combustion chamber. The exhaust will be very fuel rich, as most of what's coming down here is going to be fuel. And the rest is just hot exhaust that will get sped up and pushed out here with the rest of everything else. So over here we're going to add an extra valve. Now we can independently control how much oxidizer is going in here and how much is going in here. All the exhaust, all the rich fuel, all of the oxidizer will come into here, get burned, sent out, and thereby making sure that we don't lose as much of the efficiency as some of the other designs. And that brings us back to our launch. We're almost in orbit now. We've decoupled the fairing. You can see the payload up there. We are intending to send this past the moon. It's got a bunch of instruments. It wants to do a flyby of the moon and then probably head out into deep space. And as it passes by the moon, we're going to try and take readings and images and things like that. Stuff that has never been done before in this alternate Earth. And as you can see, the lower stage has burned out. The little teeny gimbal engines are the only ones operating on the upper stage right now. They are what is pushing that out of the interstage and keeping the propellant settled so that we can turn on the main engine. And the easiest way to see that would be to go back into the VAB, take off that fairing, and then notice how we have this stage in here. So it's coupled right there at the top. And when it decouples, these two little engines, one right there and one right there, activate and slowly, ever so gently, push this up and out of that interstage. So this slides out like that and drops away. Then we're going to activate this antenna real quick to make sure that it's pointing at something that we can continue to communicate with it. And I don't lose communication while getting myself into position or starting up the engine, because I did have that happen once in a test launch. So now we make sure to do that first. One thing to note on the payload is we are now starting to use a new system for satellite construction. It's modular satellite construction. The Kerbals have decided that they want to use modules so that all these pieces go together separately. So we have a propulsion stage. We have a command and power stage with the science instruments up there. We have communications devices in here. And we have power and science CPUs in here. And from now on, the way the Kerbals are going to make their things like satellites and all that, they're going to have all these pieces, and whatever they want to send somewhere, they're just going to put whatever modules it takes. So if they want certain science instruments, they'll take one of those. Communications, all right, we'll put one of those on. We want our CPU, okay, we'll have one like that. And each of these can then be made by different scientists on Earth, and then eventually all just bolted together, assembled at the facility here, and then turned into our payload, like so. Anyway, before we get into the payload itself, let's look one more time down here. This is now using liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen as our propellants. So that's new. So this engine down here is our Siren upper stage engine. It is powered by the liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, of course. There are various bits that go into making this. You got the engine right there, the platform that goes on the bottom with the engines and the communications. Then we have our tank, which I crafted that myself using a normal toroidal tank, but I stretched it up and down to get it to the right dimensions to make sure that it could contain all of the liquid oxygen that it needed. Then I have a little interstage connector thing here, the tank of hydrogen right there, and at the top it has the command and control computer, some communications computers, an antenna, some batteries, and of course, some lights. And that all goes up to here where we have our fairing decoupler and then our interstage to the payload. Now something must have happened with that interstage to the payload though. It's probably that it's poking up. See those little bits right there? They're poking up just a little teeny bit up into this fuel section. I'm going to have to fix that because when I go to decouple this, it pops the payload off in a way that I didn't really want. So I'm going to have to do something with that. Maybe just shift this around a little bit to get it sort of like that. I don't know. We'll figure it out on our second attempt when we launch this. I haven't used the remote tech that has these range indicators when I mouse over the possible antenna targets. I really like how it shows me whether it's going to be in range before I click on it and what the range differences actually are. Once I select the right one, now I know we're safe to fire up the main engine without losing contact, and so that's what we do. Our liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen is now burning away, sending us into our higher orbit. Speaking of communication, we're upgrading some buildings back at the KSC here in Mogadishu. We're going to improve our tracking station as well as the mission center. That'll give us access to maneuver nodes out on our orbits, patched conics so that we can see our intercept with the moon, and I'll probably increase the range that the remote tech link from here can extend. We'll also be adding some additional remote tech links all around the world because while we're busy building satellites and launchers, the rest of the world is racing to catch up with us, building all kinds of stuff everywhere. New science facilities across the world, new communications links across the world, and we need to increase the range because chances are, once we get out as far as the moon, our current ground links are not going to be going far enough in order to maintain communication out there.
After you get to Mogadishu and inspect the launch, we'll finish up here and send you some more help.
Okay, sounds good.
Bye, Katarina.
Bye, everyone.
Now, tell me about the wormhole. Still no contact. Still can't open it without causing more instability. And the human scientists have no new ideas. So our best plan is to stabilize it with a large gravity well like their planet Jupiter? Yes, sir. Okay, and what about going public? Well, that's scheduled for a week from Thursday. And how about status on the moon mission?
That's going to do it for now. Next time I'll show you how this mission failed and what we're going to do to try again. We'll cover a lot more New Earth politics, plus we'll advance our technologies again and soon start manned missions. I want to experiment with space station technologies, and in the episodes coming very soon, we'll do some manned lunar crafts for recon and landing that never happened in real life but might have in an alternate history. So until next time, I will see you later, Kerbonauts.